I think we can now formally reopen the meeting, and it's a great personal delight to introduce our speaker this evening, a lecture by Nil Palabiuk. Nil is a historian of early modern Europe's intellectual legacy. She holds an MA in English from the University of York, and after she worked in the publishing industry in London and teaching Renaissance literature at an American Studies department in Istanbul, she completed a PhD on early modern printing at the Hellenic Institute of Royal Holloway, University of London. Dr. Palabiuk held fellowships at the Scaliger Institute, Leiden University, and at the Herzog August Bibliothek Wolfenbüttel. She was Humboldt Fellow at LMU Munich and a British postdoctoral fellow at the University of Manchester before joining Queen Mary, London, in 2021. Her original doctoral thesis examined the first Greek books printed in the Ottoman Empire by a monk and scholar who commenced his publishing activity in London in the 1620s. And I had the privilege, and it was a very great privilege, to be an examiner of that thesis. Her articles have been published in various journals, including the Library, PBSA, International Journal of the Classical Tradition, and Lias. Nil's first monograph, Silent Teachers, Turkish Books in Early Modern Europe, is forthcoming with Routledge next year. And her current project investigates the interest of humanist scholars in Ottoman Turkish through readers' marks, annotations, and marginalia in 16th and 17th century books and manuscripts. So I'm really delighted, and thank you so much, Nil, for coming and also changing at the last minute from being in person to being online. We're much obliged to you. And I'm delighted now to ask you to give your lecture, which this evening is entitled The Mad, the Bad, and the Silenced, 3 Tales about Ottoman Learning and Renaissance Book Culture.
Thank you. Thank you, James, for this wonderful introduction. It's a great honor for me to give this lecture tonight. And I thank everybody for joining us at this hour of the day. So if everybody can hear me, I'll just start now. Yep. So when we think about early printed books and manuscripts in Europe, we do not necessarily consider Turkish language works. Yet Western European readers cultivated a keen interest in Ottoman culture, literature, history, and language during the 16th and 17th centuries. This engagement manifested itself in the popular eyewitness accounts, travelogues, and proto-novelistic captivity narratives, which began appearing in print. Some of the captivity and travel accounts contained sections purporting to teach Turkish, yet nobody could have been expected to learn the language through such limited and low-quality material. These popular publications were followed by the first scholarly histories of the Ottoman Empire based on Turkish chronicles. Compiled by the German linguist and historian Johannes Lönclavius with the help of language assistants, these hefty volumes quenched the thirst of many scholars who wanted to learn more about Turkey, from its ancient monuments to place names and natural resources. The reference tools that would have enabled Europeans to read Turkish on their own, such as dictionaries, grammars, and primers, were not available for a long time. A Turkish grammar was privately published in Leipzig in 1612, but the author, who had almost no Turkish, had plagiarized half of the book and compiled the rest from existing printed editions. Several other printed works on the Turkish language compiled from word lists of merchants, diplomats, and missionaries followed, but no real progress could be made until the dictionaries, commentaries, literary, philosophical, and scientific works from the Ottoman Empire could be put to use by Jacobus Gaulius and his students in Leiden in 1630s. A newly discovered set of dictionaries shows that a very rich and accurate collection of Turkish words had been compiled by 1637, decades before Francis Mininski's Thesaurus printed in Vienna in 1680. This find is very important and changes our understanding of the timeline and methodologies of Oriental lexicography in early modern Europe completely. Previously, it was thought Meninsky compiled the first comprehensive Arabic, Persian, Turkish dictionary of the 17th century, and nothing comparable had existed before. We will now, I'll first share my screen. And then continue. Okay. Yes. So we will now explore the world of Turkish books in Renaissance Europe, one publication at a time. It seems there was a particular moment in 16th century European print history when travel literature and captivity accounts concerning the Ottoman Empire flourished as a lucrative genre. From 1540s onwards, we find a plethora of popular printed editions recounting the journeys of Westerners to Constantinople and beyond. To exert their authority, early modern authors of this genre employed a number of strategies, including reciting authentic folk poetry, narrating popular prophecies, reporting daily conversations, providing lists of useful everyday vocabulary, and even writing short guides to Turkish grammar. After all, how would you prove that you crossed the Golden Horn with a local ferryman, sipped coffee at a shop overlooking the bustling port of Karaköy, or became intoxicated in a tavern in Galata before the age of social media? Insert some authentic words into your prose, and voila, you're suddenly a connoisseur of all things Ottoman. The most successful author of the customs and manners genre, a first-person account that provides snippets of information about different aspects of life in the Ottoman Empire, was a certain Bartolomeo Georgievich. And you see the title page of his first book on the left-hand side. Georgievich was a prolific and popular author who made a career out of writing pamphlets concerning his alleged captivity in Asia Minor. Georgievich's first pamphlet on the customs and festivals of the Turks appeared in 1544 in Antwerp with the print of Boris de Bonte, a printer of devotional works who later abandoned bookselling to become a priest and chaplain. The iconography of this 3-sheet small octavo firmly places it in the domain of popular literature aimed at the pious Christian. The book opens with a winged angel holding a shield carrying the initials of the author's name and epithet: Bartolomeus Georgievich Peregrinus Hierosolimitanus. The angel stands above a pedestal with a verse from the Psalms: "Depart from evil and do good," first in Greek and then in Latin. This is the middle image. And on the right-hand side, you see the image that the pamphlet closes with, another woodcut depicting the author kneeling in front of an icon of Jesus on the cross, presumably in Jerusalem, wearing a pilgrim's cloak and reading again from the Psalms: "Thou hast loosed my bonds. I offer thee the sacrifice of thanksgiving," in Latin. There are no other images in this edition. The reasons for this remain a mystery to me, but Georgievich's books and similar accounts are often presented as mines of reliable information in modern-day scholarship. This happens in the face of the skepticism of Georgievich's contemporaries of eyewitness accounts. Medieval and early modern readers were well aware of the limitations of travelers' testimonies. A striking example comes from the disputed fifth book of François Rabelais' timeless satire Gargantua and Pantagruel. The narrator takes us to the school for witnesses ran by Hearsay, a grotesque figure with 7 tongues, and I quote, "saying diverse things in diverse languages," end quote. The most enthusiastic students to be found here are contemporary traveler historians such as Ludovico de Varthema, who published his itinerary of his peregrinations through the Middle East and India in 1510, and Jacques Cartier, who published an account of his second voyage to North America in 1545. Gargantua and Pantagruel's narrator's criticism is clearly aimed at the commercial gain that these accounts generated. This is a long quote now. Upon asking which faculty they were studying, we heard that from their youth upwards, they were learning to be witnesses, earning so much money by their profession that from the time they left their province to the time they came back, they made a decent living from the witnessing trade, bearing shoe witness to anything at all for those who paid the most for a day's work. End quote. Georgievich found the right conditions for economic success in Antwerp, the publishing capital of Western Europe, where he first began churning out short books designed as diatribes against the Ottomans. His target readership and the place of publication of his books shaped their contents. Georgievich's charm lied in his ability to hone the material contained in his pamphlets according to the taste, interests, and opinions of his readers in the Protestant and Catholic domains. His books were often utilized by editors and translators who quoted him whenever an occasion to express anti-Islamic sentiments arose. On the customs and festivals of the Turks contained Georgievich's random and sometimes wildly inaccurate observations, as he calls them, and featured Turkish vocabulary and phrases for the exotic effect. The audio representations of the strange sounds from this unfamiliar country gave his works credit. The inclusion of Turkish vocabulary in such texts was a literary device, just like the vivid descriptions of costumes, the seraglio, the military processions, and the flamboyant circumcision ceremonies of the crown princes that featured heavily in the majority of these accounts. This literary technique was enabled and enhanced by typographic design of the printed page. Foreign-looking words on the page, often heavy-handedly demarcated by the use of italics, bold font, or all caps, as in this case, intended to animate and entertain the readers at home. For instance, Georgievich wrote under the section heading on their education, and it was very difficult to find a passage that wouldn't offend anyone in this book, so I chose this one. So they Skolis ipsorum, he says, they have establishments termed okumayerleri, reading centers in Turkish, in their language, and their teachers are called hocalar, teachers, the men as well as women. So I'm quoting from the middle page here on the slide. They teach astronomy, philosophy, and the art of poetry. Verses are called beyitler, couplets by them, end quote. Then he quotes 4 lines from a full poem and translates it word by word into Latin. The poem goes, "My woes multiplied 5-fold, 10-fold. I asked for the Creator's help. I left my home, my country behind. However I try, I cannot tame my heart." End quote. The 1544 Antwerp edition also featured a thematically arranged word list and the rather peculiar and stilted dialogue between a Christian merchant and an interrogating Turk. After the success of Georgievich's pamphlets in the book markets of Antwerp and Paris, it collected works containing his exhortation against the Turks, and a book about Christian suffering under the Ottomans appeared in Rome in 1552 under the title, "A Little Book Worthy of Being Read by True Christians that briefly relates various facts about Turks." The printing was undertaken by Antonio Blado, the official printer to the Vatican. With the 2 dedicatory epistles being anonymous, it is difficult to gather how much Georgievich was involved, if at all, with the preparation of this edition. It is significant, though, that the Rome edition contained the Turkish, Arabic, and Slavonic versions of the Lord's Prayer. This was the first time the Turkish version appeared in print. Georgievich presented the prayer in the context of a bizarre exchange he allegedly had with one Dervish Çelebi in Oradea, which is in Romania today. Georgievich relates that while they were stood in front of a church and engaged in a heated disputation about whether Islam or Christianity was the better religion, they saw, and I quote, "dogs entering and soiling the altar cloth." The Muslim man was astonished and asked, "Are stray dogs allowed in Christian temples?" Our narrator was ashamed and he did not know how to justify such negligence. And just like that, the dervish asked Georgievich to teach him the Lord's Prayer, which is translated into Turkish in the following page. After its first publication in Rome, the Turkish Lord's Prayer became a staple in many books about Turkey, authored by Georgievich and others. A similar publication, The Histories of the East, was compiled by the eccentric Frenchman Guillaume Postel, who's often termed the first Orientalist. He was the only scholar who wrote in this genre who actually advocated the learning of Turkish. The Histories of the East, printed in Paris in 1575 in the pocket-sized sextodecimal format, included a 20-page section entitled Instruction on the Words of the Turkish Language. The first 9 pages of the instruction explain basic grammar rules and how personal pronouns and their declinations, articles, nouns, questions, cases, singular and plural nouns, verbs and tenses work in Turkish by drawing comparisons with French, Latin, and Greek. Postel remarked that the Turkish language evolved and developed considerably between his 2 visits to Constantinople, but also since he first began learning it almost 40 years ago. Next comes the Turkish-French-Latin word list that is almost identical to Georgievich's, save for a few improvements. Postel's histories also reprinted the Turkish Lord's Prayer, which you see on the right-hand side on the slide. Postel visited East on 2 occasions. In 1536, he accompanied the French ambassador on a mission to Sultan Süleyman's court. He was to improve his Arabic, learn Turkish, and collect Oriental manuscripts for King Francis's library in Fontainebleau. He also took daily instruction in Arabic from a Turkish tutor who, according to Postel, was a secret Christian and became very attached to a student during lectures that involved reading passages from the Quran. The teacher would always focus on verses that praised Jesus Christ, Virgin Mary, John the Baptist, and the evangelists. After this encounter, Postel was determined to have the Bible translated into Turkish. This project never found the support and funding necessary. Postel's memoirs reveal that his scholarly interests and writing were fueled by his political and religious aspirations. He advocated a utopian worldview in which he imagined a mystical version of Christianity to be a unified and universal faith that would be embraced eventually by all human beings. Part of this ideology stipulated the conversion of Muslims to Christianity and gathering the people of the East under the banner of the French king. Such was the progress he made in Constantinople. Upon his return to Paris, Postel began teaching Arabic at Collège Royal. He first published a guide to 12 languages, which included a short grammar of Arabic, and his fully fledged Arabic grammar, Grammatica Arabica, appeared sometime between 1538 and 43. His second visit was in 1549 in the retinue of the French ambassador Gabriel de Lutz, who had been accompanying Sultan Süleyman on his Persian expedition. During this stay, Postel collected biblical manuscripts in Syriac and Arabic and searched for interpreters who could translate the Gospels into Turkish. Compiling an Oriental dictionary, which was direly needed at the time, was another wish of Postel's. On June 1550, he wrote to his theologian friend Andreas Macius from Constantinople in Pera. If possible, and I quote now, if possible, I shall make sure that the world has a dictionary with which future generations can obtain what I can only wish for. I shall serve as a whetstone, as we are to understand Horace said, which makes iron sharp, though it is itself incapable of cutting, end quote. This wonderful Horatian metaphor describes the role Postel played in early modern Orientalism perfectly, as the scholar who set things in motion. Postel advocated learning of Turkish, when the knowledge of it among university professors was rare. One encounter was particularly impactful. In 1562, Guillaume Postel was hiding from the Inquisition for his unorthodox beliefs. In a serendipitous turn of events, he was forced to share board with a young man in a small room on top of Mama Peterson's printing house in Paris. This young man was Joseph Justus Scaliger, who was to become arguably the most celebrated humanist scholar of Northern Europe. This chance encounter with a scholar who had spent extensive periods in the Ottoman Empire and wrote one of the first European grammars of Arabic deeply affected Scaliger. He would reminisce the week he spent with Postel reading and discussing Oriental texts towards the end of his life. On 22nd of March, 1608, he wrote to the French Orientalist Etienne Hubert, and I quote, "We stayed in the same room, and I let him have my bed because I thought that I would be able to benefit from seeing him on a daily basis. But after he had lived with me for a week, he was thrown into prison, a man who clearly could not have done any evil, since he was mad." End quote. Especially during his time in Leiden, Scaliger collected Turkish calendars, read Turkish poetry, owned Turkish dictionaries. His important work on global calendrical systems, De Emendatione Temporum, made available the Oriental 12-year animal cycle in Turkish to a European readership. Scaliger's private study notes reveal that he studied an ode, a qaside, to Sultan Süleyman by Baki, the most celebrated court poet of the 16th century Turkey. He annotated printed books such as the Annals of the Ottoman Sultans, the title page of which you see on the slide now, and the History of Muslim Turks, compiled from original sources by the German linguist Johannes Lohnclavius. These handsome folio editions were printed in Frankfurt's prestigious Bechel House. And here you see the various annotations Scaliger left on his copy, which is now in a Bibliotheca Tiziana in Leiden, a private library. And this copy was not known before I found it in Leiden in 2015. It is very, very strange because there are collectors out there who are looking for annotated books by Scaliger. It's quite big business. But. So Scaliger, as an influential senior scholar, opened up the way for younger generation of Leiden Orientalists, such as Thomas Erpenius and Jacobus Golius, to learn Turkish and study Arabic and Persian through Turkish sources. This new shift in focus from comparative study of Hebrew and Arabic through biblical sources to the use of Ottoman reference works hailed a new era in early modern Oriental studies. Rapid progress only began to be made when bilingual, that is Arabic-Turkish or Persian-Turkish dictionaries, commentaries, and other linguistic tools commonly studied in Ottoman madrasas began to be utilized by European scholars. When Scaliger was studying Turkish in the first decade of the 17th century, there was not a single printed grammar available. And when one finally became available after his death, it left much to be desired. The publication of the Principles of the Turkish Language in 4 books in 1612 was a small and private affair, yet it was cause for scandal. The author, German linguist, historian, and poet laureate Hieronymus Megiza, who self-published the volume in Leipzig, was not only lacking in morals, but also in his knowledge of the language. This book was not written by Megiza, as the title page suggests, but only partly compiled by him. The Principles strikes one as a composite work, the work of more than one person with parts of varying quality. Books 1 and 2, which teach the alphabet and the nouns, pronouns and verbs, are similar in content, scope, and reliability to the Arabic grammars produced in Europe around the same time, such as those published by Erpenius and Peter Kisten, who published half of Megiza's book with his Arabic type in Breslau, by the way. Megiza falsely claimed the authorship of these two authentic books. Books 3 and 4, on the other hand, fit the bill as works compiled by someone who did not necessarily know Turkish. The contents of these two books align with Megiza's two professional interests, paremiology and lexicology, and contain material he mostly recycled from previous publications, including Georgievich's books. The physical evidence from the printed edition supports this divide. The individual title pages of books 3 and 4 carry Megiza's name, while the title pages of the first two books do not. The quality of the contents of books 3 and 4 leave much to be desired. Megiza's collection of Turkish proverbs is full of mistakes and nonsensical sentences. The bilingual dictionary also has an unusual number of misleading entries and spelling errors. In fact, these mistakes were already documented and corrected by Johann Melchior Mader, a young Orientalist scholar just after Megiza's death in 1619. We know from Mader's album Amicorum that Mader had met Megiza in Linz in 1618. In the same year, Mader also gave an oration on the importance of Arabic, in which Megiza is mentioned in a positive light. But in 1620, when Mader acquired a rare copy of Megiza's Principles with a dedication to his benefactor, Hector von Ernau, he entered his bad books. Mader quickly mustered the courage to expose him. He was bitter enough to begin a fully fledged smear campaign against the late Megiza in print, branding him a fraud who knew no Turkish and who published a grammar written by someone else and passed it as his own. Mader's unique copy demonstrates a contemporary reader's extremely negative reaction to this publication. The copy was first mentioned by Paul Corey of Mag's Books, London, to Alistair Hamilton, who passed the inquiry on to me. And I was kindly invited to the shop to examine the copy in the summer of 2015. This volume has since traveled to Vienna and was finally bought by Princeton University Library 2 years ago. As you shall see on the left-hand side, an angry Mader crossed out the autore in the title page of his copy and replaced it with descriptore. On the bifolium insert, the next two pages, with the dedication to Ernau, Mader wrote, and I quote the handwritten note on the right-hand side page, "In the rest of the copies, other than this, and the ones Megiza sent to Lord Hector von Ernau, this dedication is omitted. Therefore, it seems as if he is the author of the work, whereas he's only the editor. In fact, the Lord of Ernau wrote and distributed the work in Constantinople, and Megiza brought it forth as its author, although he was not," end quote. And there's truth in Mader's claims. In the 57 copies of the Principles I inspected physically in person, including the copies in London, Oxford, Paris, Ghent, Leiden, and Munich, or through correspondence with librarians around the globe, I have not come across another copy that carries this dedication to von Ernau. The fact that it is an insert without signatures outside the standard collation of the volume further supports Mader's claim that the extra dedication was printed separately, privately, and only meant to be added to a select number of copies. Mader repeated his accusations against Megiza next year in print, buried in a book on horses entitled Equestrianism, that is the art of horse riding. This was a part professional, Mader was a veterinarian by training, and part vanity publication, because dedications took up more than half of the book. One of these dedications is to Johann Ulrich, the son of Hector von Ernau, and acknowledges Mader's gratitude to his father. Mader cannot praise the virtues, piety, and honesty of von Ernau enough. Even those, and I quote, at the Ottoman court sang his praises, for his mind rejoiced in being dedicated to virtue rather than vice, to work rather than leisure, end quote. Mader then goes on to explain, once again, how Megiza falsely claimed to be the author of the first printed grammar of Turkish, and how he is going to revise this work. What is, and I quote from his book on equestrianism, what is this principles of the Turkish language? Megiza, this would-be author, published it 8 years ago, but it is full of errors because he does not know the language. We shall revise them, add Turkish, Persian, and Arabic dainties, and publish them soon in corrected form, end quote. Clearly, Mader's interleaved copy was the revised edition of the principles that he was preparing for publication, yet it was never published. Mader is likely to have died before he could send this manuscript to print during 30 Years' War. So far, we have seen a Georgievich who turned his likely fictitious captivity into a writing career. He was an opportunist who churned out pamphlet after pamphlet about all things Ottoman, whether it was a critique of the taxation of non-Muslims, a call to arms against marching Turkish armies, or a book bringing together tidbits about daily life in the empire. A madman, Postel, who wanted to translate the Gospels into Turkish in order to convert the whole Muslim world into his universal version of Catholicism. He visited Constantinople twice, read the Quran with a Turkish tutor, brought back many manuscripts with him, but never mastered Turkish. He wanted to serve as a whetstone in influencing others and leaving a legacy. This he achieved in the way he inspired scholarship. Scholarship promoted a new and at the time revolutionary approach to the study of Arabic and Persian through Turkish sources. The Ottoman histories scholarship so intently studied were based on Turkish chronicles that enjoyed a wide circulation in the empire. The author, Learn Clavius, however, was not fluent enough in Turkish to read the original sources himself. But this was nothing compared to Megiza, whose name is associated with the first printed grammar of Turkish. Megiza had plagiarized another man's work and published it as his own with additional material from other printed sources. If you're thinking Turkish language publishing in early modern Europe was a series of mishaps, you're not incorrect. Now we will look at the last part in a chain of unfortunate events and see how one of the most influential Oriental dictionaries of the 17th century was buried in obscurity because its author today is remembered, if at all, as a cantankerous polemicist of mediocre medical treatises. In 2017, I was Humboldt Fellow at LMU Munich. A stone throws away was the Bavarian State Library from my office. And there lied two unassuming volumes that have never been called from the stacks since the 19th century. The first of the hefty volumes is a Turkish-Persian Latin dictionary, and the second is a Turkish-Latin dictionary, both compiled by one Anton Doising, while he was a medical student in Leiden, and lived like other promising young men with his teacher Jacobus Folius, the celebrated professor of Oriental languages and mathematics at the University of Leiden. The first volume, the Persian-Turkish-Latin dictionary, comprises 317 folios, and with 30 headwords per page arranged in double columns, it carries approximately 18,000 entries. The second volume is a Turkish-Latin dictionary derived from the first one. In 232 folios with 37 entries per page, arranged again in double columns, it gives us approximately 17,000 entries. Both codices come in vellum binding, which is a hallmark of a 17th century scholarly library, and the script is a Dutch hand of the Golden Age. And then I had to date, obviously, these manuscripts, and I tried to find some paper evidence and watermark evidence, of course, and each volume carries a single watermark throughout, which tells me that a ream of paper was earmarked for this task of writing a good copy of these dictionaries, and paper was in abundance in this location. So the Persian-Turkish dictionary has a watermark depicting a crozier with a cross, which was used in Holland in the first half of the 17th century, and it is recorded in Hewood. And the Turkish dictionary has a watermark depicting a crown shield with a fleur-de-lis. There's a countermark with the letters N and A, and the paper is datable to 1637 and comes from Wendelin Wihel's mill in the Strasbourg area. It is catalogued in Laurentius. So these dates from paper evidence agree with the years Doising matriculated at Leiden University from 1630 to 37. But who is this Doising, you might ask? Well, at first, I didn't know either. His name is today never mentioned among the Orientalists of the 17th century. Moreover, secondary literature presents him in a very negative light. And the source of this can be traced back to one Jelle Banga, who wrote the history of medicine and its practitioners in the Netherlands in Dutch in 1868. The first biography of Doising in a vernacular language, Banga's biased account became blueprint for later scholarship. Having read Galen and Hippocrates not with historical interest, but as textbooks in his youth, Banga applied himself at the ripe age of 82 to scouring hundreds of early modern medical treatises derived from classical Greek and medieval Islamic sources. I cannot comment on whether Banga desperately needed a recondite hobby to fill the long afternoons of his retirement days, or reading these obscure treatises filled his heart with a sense of nostalgia for the dying art of classical medicine, but he was likely the last person to have read Doising's abundant output, especially the medical treatises the Groningen professor quickly churned out whenever a colleague developed an interest in theory or conducted a new experiment. It is clear that Banga's disdainful view of Doising's personality, writing style, and medical opinions has single-handedly set the tone for later publications. But I soon came to understand that the secondary sources do little justice to Doising, the Orientalist, and to appreciate him in his intellectual milieu, we need to go back to the accounts of his contemporaries. Testimonies by his Leiden teachers and friends and Groningen colleagues describe a very different man, a diligent scholar who, in addition to his formal training in medicine, philosophy, and Arabic, devoted many leisure hours to learning Turkish and Persian. Doising was very fortunate to be in Leiden in 1630s, in one of the leading centers for scholarship during the formative period of Oriental studies in Western Europe. He was esteemed by his teacher Golius, who happily received him into his household and gave him free access to his rich personal library, collecting during his stays in Aleppo and Constantinople in 1626 to 29. Doising was commended by Louis de Dieu, whose Rudimenta Linguae Persicae, the first printed grammar of Persian, would have had no substance without Doising's input. Doising's complete published and unpublished works are listed at the end of the printed text of his funeral oration delivered by a theologian colleague in Groningen on 5th of February 1666. According to this list, Doising authored over 40 treatises and 14 essays on medicine and chemistry. He authored or edited, sometime anonymously, several momentous works on Oriental languages, including a Latin translation of Avicenna's poem on medicine from its Arabic original, which was printed in Groningen in 1649 with a dedication to Golius, an edition of a Judeo-Persian translation of the Pentateuch, which was printed in Constantinople in the 16th century, and Doising transliterated the Hebrew into Arabic script and vocalized the Persian for beginners, and the expanded edition of Thomas Arpinius's Grammatica Arabica, the most influential Arabic grammar of the century. Through an extensive search, I was able to unearth a near full collection of his autograph works, today dispersed to different libraries, including Groningen, where he spent most of his career as a medical doctor, and some of his manuscripts found their way to Göttingen in Munich through later acquisitions. The entries in the dictionary indicate that a comprehensive Persian, Turkish, Latin dictionary compiled in Europe in the 17th century depended heavily on the works of Ottoman lexicographers. And this cryptic list that you see on the slide gives us these source texts that Doising employed. We'll quickly go through them. Then the first item on the list, M for Merilla, is a short Persian Dutch Latin word list compiled by the Leiden professor Paulus Merilla, and it is now lost. We only know about it through Doising's dictionary. Merilla, along with Franciscus Raphaelengus the Elder and Scaliger, was one of the first scholars to develop the linguistic theory, which investigated the grammatical and etymological ties between Persian and the Germanic languages. The second item on the list, D for Danistan, is identifiable as the Tuhfetul Hadiye, a Persian Turkish dictionary, often referred to as Danistan, to know in Persian, because this was the first entry of this dictionary. And the third item on the list, Leyer, is a minor glossary compiled by Willem Leyer, a merchant of the Danish East India Company. It is now lost. The fourth item on the list, TP for Tractatus Philosophicus, is a cosmological work entitled Jami Getunuma, Mirror Revealing the World, written by the 15th century Qadi and philosopher Hussein Maibudi in Shiraz in 1492. And Doising's list of sources continues with a manuscript that contained a translation of the four Gospels in Persian, in addition to a tract on the life of Christ, published by Leiden in De Dieu. And then we have R for Arab Shah. This is the history of Timur in Arabic by Ibn Arab Shah, a 14th century scholar, and the text was published in Golius by Golius in 1636 in Leiden. Then we have Epistola Persica. This is likely a Persian insha, a letter writing manual. The next item on the list is Ibn Hajib, an early 17th century monolingual Persian dictionary entitled Majma al-Furs, a collection of the words of Persians. And last but not the least, Log, the Lugati Nimetullah, abbreviated. The Log here is a Persian Turkish dictionary written by Nimetullah of Sofia, who died in 1561. This was a very popular work of reference with widespread pedagogical use in the Ottoman Empire, and many copies seem to have arrived in Europe during the late 16th and early 17th century. This rich reference tool, which comprised over 16,000 words in its fuller recensions, was used as a source text for many famous Oriental dictionaries produced in Europe, including Golius's Persian and Turkish lexica and Mininsky's Thesaurus. All these sources, other than Merilla and Leyer, can now be traced back to Golius's private library in Oxford, and it's among the Marsh collection there, and the Golius collection at the Leiden University Library. A look at one random entry, which we will do now, at Sitare. It's a noun meaning star in Persian, from Doising's dictionary, and the comparison of it with other dictionaries reveals a lot about Doising's methodology, which consisted of translating Turkish explications word by word into Latin, and also tells us a lot about his influence on other better-known Oriental dictionaries of the 17th century, such as those by Golius and Mininsky. So this is Doising's entry for Stella, and for Sitare, which he translates all the Turkish explications into Latin, and then he gives us the sources where he got each meaning from. So Danistan, Lugati Nimetullah, Ibn Hajar, and so on. And next is the source that he was most influenced by, Lugati Nimetullah, this Persian Turkish dictionary. And it has this long description, which he translates as a curtain or covering with needlepoint decorations or colored images of flowers. And that comes from the Leiden copy of the Lugati Nimetullah. And if we compare Doising's entry with Gorlius's dictionary, which is today in Oxford, the same entry, Citare, I have tried to show the differences between the two entries with bold letters. And you will realize that actually Doising's entry, which is earlier, is longer and more comprehensive than his teacher Gorlius's. But you will also recognize that the handle of the main entry in both the Munich and the Oxford manuscripts is actually the same. If you look at the word Felicitas or Stella or Cortina, you will realize that it's exactly the same hand. And then Gorlius's Persian dictionary was printed as part of Edmund Castell's Lexicon Heptaglotton in 1669 in London, this huge dictionary. And the Persian part was prepared from a manuscript that was sent by Gorlius to London. And it was edited by William Seaman, who tried to translate the New Testament into Turkish, and he produced a very, very poor translation, but I will not talk about that. But as you can see, this entry, which was printed as Gorlius's dictionary, is actually very similar to that of Doising, and there was not much progress between 1630s and 1670 when this was published. And then I mentioned this Thesaurus of Meninsky, which has so far been accepted as the most comprehensive dictionary of Oriental languages in the 17th century, which was printed in Vienna in 1680. And when we go to the entry for Citare, we again see almost an identical entry to that of Doising, with a few Italian explications added by Meninsky. So to conclude, although unpublished and forgotten in the archives, Doising's dictionaries were highly influential and formed the basis of the most accomplished Oriental lexica of the century. And it was only his name that was never associated with Oriental learning in early modern Europe. So from the old word in Turkish appearing in cheap prints about travel or captivity in the Ottoman Empire, to the most comprehensive reference tools for Turkish learning in early modern Europe, this is the checkered history of Turkish language publishing. I was only able to share several sketches in this lecture, but I hope that you will leave this evening with an impression of what kind of print publications and manuscripts pertaining to the Ottoman Empire circulated in Europe in this period. Thank you.